everyone. I'm going to speak without a mic, so hopefully you can hear me all, but thank you for quieting down just naturally. And welcome. So happy you could join us tonight. I'm pleased to introduce Claire Agre, consulting principal at Westgate, kicking off our lecture series here with a look at a visionary design practice in landscape architecture, leading large-scale, multidisciplinary work to address tough challenges. Earlier today, we heard a little bit about how Westgate is building resilience and diversity in the public realm and addressing impacts of climate change. Claire has led design and implementation for a diverse portfolio of projects, including Governor's Island Park, the 1,000-acre 40-year master plan for Longwood Gardens, Duke University Sculpture Park, Miami Beach Soundscape Park, and the winning entry for Changing Course, which I think we might hear a little more about tonight, an interdisciplinary international design competition seeking solutions for the disappearing lower Mississippi Delta. And closest to us here in Austin, Claire led the team responsible for phase 1 of the Houston Botanic Garden, slated to open in 2020. We're so fortunate to have Claire with us at this particular moment in time. It's the first lecture she'll give as consulting principal at Westgate and simultaneously co-founder of a very new and exciting practice, Unknown Studio, based in Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a lot of equipment. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here in Austin. I've been here a few times. My cousin is in the front row to heckle me here. That's his job. It's really great to be here. Phoebe and I touched base on this earlier in the year to talk a little bit about what might be of interest here. I'm going to finish with the Texas work and start with a little bit of the kind of resilience work and kind of take us on an arc. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about practice and landscape architecture. People who don't know much about it might kind of oversimplify it. I think those of you who are studying it and who practice in it know that you have to deliver a lot. You have to be in budget, you have to be on time, you have to be able to see into the future in terms of flooding and climate and resilience. You have to be sustainable, and so really you have to be the conductor of an entire orchestra. And the broader your practice is, the more this becomes the case, everything from playgrounds to regional plans. And it's been a real privilege at Westgate because that's very much the way that practice is organized. It's a little bit of everything. For my part, though, I think the reward and the reason I wanted to get into this profession and the reason I love it so much is to kind of see that tangible joy when you open a project and when it's delivered. So it's more than just ideas, but it's about actually creating tangible, real spaces that communities, kids, grandmas, everybody can kind of come around and enjoy together. So just a little bit about kind of my trajectory and what I've been up to. I have been working for the Dutch firm Westgate for about 11 years. And it's been a real privilege working with them. As you probably know, they're a renowned design firm founded about 30 years ago. And I was one of the founding designers in the New York City office in 2008. And as Phoebe mentioned, I've taken kind of a big step recently as well. While I'm working on a few projects as a design principal at Westgate, I've also started my own practice in Baltimore, Maryland called Unknown Studio with a longtime friend, Nick Glaze. So more on that soon, I hope. It felt very natural. Rotterdam and Baltimore happen to be sister cities. There's a lot about the kind of attitude of Westgate Rotterdam that I think is a natural fit for Baltimore, which happens to be my hometown. And at different moments in time, maybe there's a kind of similar way of thinking as well. So for those of you who know Rotterdam, it was bombed during the war. It had to completely reinvent its sensibility because of so much vacancy. So within this sort of matrix of historic neighborhoods were these wide open spaces. And out of that came some of the world's most exciting architectural practices of the 20th century. So I hope there's room for reinvention in Baltimore as well. Probably you know these scenes from The Wire. There's more to it than that, but lots of challenges and lots of potential territory to think about there. So, but most importantly, as John Waters, of course, Baltimore is a city full of art, very easy to live in, full of weirdos, and a great place to live and create. So more to come soon on Baltimore, I hope, and Unknown Studio. But for now, I want to go back to the Dutch for a little bit. So I've been kind of seeing the world through the Dutch eyes, and I think they've been seeing America through my eyes, and it's been really a reciprocal and successful relationship in that way. Tocqueville, of course, sort of showed America what they looked like from the outside, and I think that's so important wherever you're practicing to try and take an insider and an outsider look, whether it's through a relationship with a local or through conversations with the community. But so look at it both ways is going to make your project richer so that you don't become formulaic or you don't start applying a kind of colonial mentality that you're always kind of doing both. So Adrian has been sort of my Tocqueville a little bit over the last 10 years. He has a wonderful sense of humor and a really magical way of getting to the kind of heart of what a culture and a sensibility and a spirit might be for a place. And I think that's why every project looks different. Here we are at the opening of Governor's Island with first of two. He's also just been a really wonderful mentor to me. So what he brings, I think, to work in the United States is a kind of unexpected, whimsical interpretation of something that we might take for granted. So here, one of the first built projects by West 8 in North America, a temporary installation at the Spoleto Festival, creating a kind of room of Spanish moss in a way that maybe only someone who doesn't grow up with it might consider. We're here in Toronto, a very whimsical and exuberant, and God only knows how they got this through, take on the Canadian boardwalk or the Canadian waterfront, the famous wave decks. And this one I had the privilege to work on. This is Miami Beach Soundscape. Behind us is the Frank Gehry building. To our right, Lincoln Road and South Beach. And you all probably know very well the Art Deco architecture of Miami Beach. So this was sort of a very fast and furious, contemporary and whimsical redo of what the kind of spirit of Miami Beach could be, sort of blending Gehry with Art Deco and kind of spilling it out into a park. So that's a little bit of what the highlights of some of the things I worked on with Audrey. And I also have learned a lot about the Dutch. And I think if it's of interest to you to look outside the States, there's probably, maybe with the exception of the Swiss, one of the most important cultures to start to understand is how the Dutch relate to their landscape. Everything is engineered to the millimeter. And we all know the beautiful windmills, but I think first and foremost, this is about engineering, and it's about an existential problem, which is, as you know, they're below sea level. When I was a kid, this is what I thought it was, the Dutch, you know, the little boy, and he stops the flood, but we know it's much more serious than that. The Dutch are renowned around the world for their delta works and for basically protecting their entire country from the uncertainty of climate change. They're about 4 centuries ahead of us in terms of thinking about flooding, and at least a century ahead of us in terms of thinking about resilience. So this is the famous Delta Works just outside of Rotterdam. They know how to do this better than almost anybody, and they've actually recently started letting water in as well. So the result is a landscape that's highly ordered, highly organized. The topographic maps of the Netherlands are to the centimeter. I mean, it is astounding. And the result is a landscape that's highly organized and highly ordered and also very productive. So these beautiful tulip fields, this is all about economics. And you have to kind of wonder if this has led to this amazing design culture that we have in the Netherlands, where you can blend engineering, design, beauty, and these things all kind of have a synthesis that come together. This idea that you create the landscape, then you paint the landscape, then you even abstract the landscape. More recently, though, and a lot of people have written about this, the Dutch are getting a little less rigid in terms of how they deal with water, and they're beginning to let the water in, which is something that we're going to be doing a lot, I think, here in the States, in a place where we can't just levee the entire country. So this is from Room for the River, a massive project in the Netherlands that many worked on, and which is actually getting built. So this is allowing water to actually come in and flood certain areas, and farmers have had to relocate as a result of this project. The difference in the Netherlands is the entire country is aligned around this project. It's existential. I don't know if we'll ever have that here, but it's an interesting debate. And what West 8 does as well is not to forget to bring the beauty back. So even these pump stations, these lookout points, they become artifacts and they become kind of totems and places for people to gather around and to visit. So with that, I'm going to talk us through 3 projects that I've led while at West 8. The first one at the largest scale is the Giving Delta, closest to here. This was for a really fabulous design competition that was led by the Environmental Defense Fund. It basically invited international design teams to look at the entire lower Mississippi Delta. And I will tell you, at the kickoff, it was probably 65% Dutch guys, and you can tell because they're all tall and skinny and they wear the same glasses. And at the end, we were the Dutch team, more or less. Sasaki was one of the other teams, and then a kind of multidisciplinary academic team. So this was really first and foremost a socioeconomic problem. We all care about the fact that the Delta is disappearing, but it's existential for the people who live there. So the small fisheries, the canneries, the tourism industry, and not last of all the culture, the amazing culture that we have in the New Orleans area. So this is what the Delta looks like today. This is what they call the bird's foot, and this is slowly sinking into the Gulf of Mexico. So how do we create this amazing culture, or keep this amazing culture from disappearing? Does anyone know this movie on the left? So good, Beast of the Southern Wild. The idea that we could just let this culture disappear or polluter this entire thing or evacuate it and call it a national park was not an option. And that was not what the brief asked us to do. It asked us to look at a viable socioeconomic solution for how the culture, the economies, and the settlements of the Louisiana Delta could continue for the next century. So the statistics are staggering. The lower Delta, and let me see if I can do this pointer. Here's New Orleans, right here. The lower Mississippi loses about a football field of land every hour. If that were New York, Manhattan would be gone in a year and a half. So this has been ongoing for decades. And it's not something that's new either. This is a fabulous book for all the landscape architects. You have to read McPhee. He talks about this and some other really interesting case studies in his book of essays, The Control of Nature. And he talks very humorously about the battle that the Army Corps of Engineers is waging against the Mississippi River. So essentially, the river wants to do this, but it's doing this. And that's because deltas, as you know, they move around and they want to move around and then find the shortest path. So he sort of compares it to a piano player, you know, playing the keys up and down. And so the delta, the river right now, has sort of stayed too long in its current course. It's levied, and all the sediment is flying off into the Gulf of Mexico. It wants to go down the Atchafalaya, so we have an issue here. Like so many landscape problems, we have a problem of jurisdiction. So this is the way the map of Louisiana is drawn. From all the images you've already seen, you know this is nothing like what it actually is. It's soft, it's marshy, it's full of canals, it moves around. And this is the way the Army Corps looks at it, as a series of channels and flood protection. So they had a twofold mission, the Army Corps, which was keep the adjacent lands and farms from flooding, which they do a pretty good job at, and keep this channel open for navigation, which is an economic mission. The problem with that is that everything else, small fisheries, native ecology, small settlements, are not on the list. And when you look at the fact that this river drains 40% of the United States, all of that sediment has been effectively channeled by the Army Corps to fly off the continental shelf. So we're losing all of that land every single year. So when you combine that, you can understand why it's not getting replenished, and then sea level rise is raising at the same time. We have a pretty dramatic problem. So this is just a series of graphs that we made. This is what the coast looked like in 2015 when we did this design competition. You can see how kind of eaten away it looks. This is what it would look like if we don't change the status quo approach, just continue letting the river fall off the shelf. And this is what would happen if we said, like, we can't do anything, just take the levees down. So then the river would do what it wants to do, go right down the Atchafalaya. New Orleans would become an island with no drinking water, all that cultural heritage lost, all the socioeconomics of that region lost. And it's not just the small-scale fisheries, it's the port, it's all of the freight that comes waterborne through the center of the country. So this was a great competition because it asked to bring together ecologists, economists, scientists, engineers, cultural heritage, all these people to come together. So we had this really big, fabulous team, all these people bringing expertise together, and we had to learn to talk to each other, which is not something scientists and engineers are very good at. So they had to kind of tell us what they knew. We had to try and speak it back to them. We had to try and illustrate it. We had to kind of create a clear narrative, clear strategy. They get super frustrated because we're all idiots and they've been doing this their whole careers and they know the answer. This is Jeff and Jonathan, who I love. But at the end, we came up with a sort of 1 year and 100-year strategy that was, we thought, pretty robust in how it dealt with the region. So we thought a lot about the system. Odin's great for this because he really shows us how to diagram something that is temporal, long-term, systemic, wicked. And so we started diagramming the different forces. So the Army Corps, as we said, they focused on two things. We need to bring in many more layers. We need to reconnect ecosystem. We need to reconnect human settlement, working coast. All of these need to kind of work in one system. So we started even at global scale. We said, why does this make any sense? New Orleans is actually perfectly located on almost the nexus of train freight, also on the river. And economically, I mentioned earlier in our kind of roundtable the importance of economics, and the economists on this project were fabulous because they could kind of pull these stats. Sorry, this got a little cut off. But basically, the economic value of the port in this region is the same as the auto industry, which had just recently gotten a bailout. So to kind of be able to speak in economic terms was really helpful. So we sliced it into long, large, big time frame, 100-year global economics, 4 generations out, because that's kind of as far as I think any of us can really think. And we sort of set goals that way. Then we also thought about small and short, so the annual time frame of the river. What happens every year during the flood cycle? How much can the oysters kind of tolerate in terms of change? The oyster was a really good kind of harbinger for what we were going to do because he, like us, can't get up and move. So if you flood the oyster or drown the oyster, then the whole thing doesn't work. This is just talking about salinity, keeping those oysters happy. So this is just a sort of diagram of the overall intent. So when we're looking at it today, it's very dispersed. The wetlands are losing contiguity. And the ambition was to really consolidate and focus the delta. We were never going to restore it to what it once was, but the idea was to make it smaller, more sustainable. And to go from this model, the old Army Corps model, to something like this, to kind of create a wetland apron around the major settlements, and to use some of you can see that what's new here, to allow the river to begin to flood this area again so it can get that sediment it desperately needs. So taking the wetlands we have, sustaining them, and then the second part is really to use the river for what it's good at, which is its incredible ability to deliver huge amounts of sediment back to this region. So we took these structures, which are very familiar right now, and we gave them a new operation. We started cutting into them, made more passive levels, allowed them to seasonally flood in different places, and we worked very carefully to make sure we're flooding the areas that are not inhabited for the most part, not in cities. And the engineers who were so frustrated I showed earlier were very careful to work with the scientists to make sure we're just letting enough salt water in during the season that the oysters can tolerate it, and not when they couldn't. And this is all based on the life cycle of the oyster. So I won't go into too much detail on this, but Robert Twilley, who I just showed there, was really an expert in this, and he started to show how different lobes of the delta, some are prograding, some are receding, and the area over here in the Atchafalaya, which is growing, became our kind of case study for how we keep the oysters happy in this project. This is the Atchafalaya. This is what it looks like, really magical. So that gave us the kind of right kind of openings for those different flood structures based on the oysters. And then we showed where they each were, where each one was, the kind of total volume that comes through. So then the last piece is really about economics. So if we're going to be able to do all that, and we're going to be able to sustain that wetland apron and get all that sediment in there, again, that's great. But what do people do for a living? Where are they going to live? They need to know and be able to tell their kids and their grandkids, yes, you can stay in this town. No, we should move to another village. It's already happening. So we worked a lot with this geologist, Giannis, who helped us really identify the areas of highest versus lowest risk. So when you look at these areas right now, some of these areas are in such dramatic areas of settlement that we really could not kind of put them on the map for the future. So there's sort of a defined retreat kind of idea. The channel itself, we protected to a point. but then the idea was basically to move the entire port operation, which is all spread along this bird's foot, consolidate all of it out of harm's way, and this big rainbow sherbet is the area of greatest consolidation that I mentioned. So not to go into too much on the port, but global economics, super interesting. If you upgrade the port in one, a kind of larger chunk, the whole project can pay for itself in 1 to 2 years of operation. This has not happened. Lastly, probably the most romantic and kind of appealing to many of us, kind of humanists, how do we make sure that the amazing culture of Louisiana doesn't get lost? Part of it, working with the Coastal Sustainability Studio, is about giving people a very honest, clear picture of what the future holds so that they can plan. So they created these amazing maps that showed the population and the risk, and this is based on settlement, subsidence, also flood, so that people can make choices. In the words of Adrian, which I thought was so great, he's like, we can't tell a crazy bearded hermit in the marsh if he can or cannot live there like we do in the Netherlands, but we can at least give him the information. So that's sort of what this was about. And the idea of integrating new infrastructure, investments, so that the spines of investment become very much consolidated. So this is the overall phasing plan. This is what it looks like today. We cut all those holes into the levee so that we have room for the river to flood and to deposit sediment in the different basins. We start to cut off the bird's foot down here. And then we actually change the course of the Mississippi River. So we create the new rational channels here and the new port infrastructure as the overall wetland is receding and consolidating. These are those spines, really encouraging people to settle along these spines. And then this is by year 100. We have a more sustainable consolidated delta that's being replenished every year while allowing the local economics to continue. So as you saw before, this is what it would have been. This is the plan. So this was one of the winning, there were 3 winners from this competition. Sort of hurt because you want to be the winner, but there were 3 winners. We don't know what will happen with this. My brother lives in New Orleans. He says it's not on anyone's radar, really. So to be determined. I think the last piece, which is what people always ask about, is, well, what can be done? We have great references in the United States about how do you take on these huge problems. Part of it is about kind of identifying regional culture and making them special. So these are the 5 basins of this area. Part of it is thinking about it as a system, both the water system and the marsh system. And then part of it is about policy. And the 2 references I think are really interesting are both about economics. So Transcontinental Railroad on the right, huge infrastructural project, right? This is the kind of thing where you need some strong person saying we're going to do this. On the left is the National Forest Service, which I think is even more relevant because this is almost, to this day, kind of an individual scale, incrementally replanting, reforesting, and the mission of the National Forest Service is to do the most good for the most number of people. So I think that's a model for this region that could be really interesting. So this is just our sort of map at the end. At the end, this could be sort of an economic project where if we could incrementally make these changes, maybe we can turn the situation around. Okay, with that, I'm going to go into 2 more designy projects. This is Governor's Island in the winter. The island was once shaped like this. It was called Nutton Island, and it was inhabited by the Lenape, who were the Native American tribe who was in a lot of the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. But it was, of course, inhabited by the Dutch, then it became New Amsterdam and then New York, and you can see that the shape of the island has dramatically changed here. So this is the original Nutton Island, which is a granite outcropping, and then when they built the 6th Avenue subway, they put all the fill out here. So this is just flat as a pancake out on this side. And we always call it the ice cream cone, so the ice cream is the North Island, the kind of original island, and then the south side is the cone. So this is what it looked like on the South Island, wonderful McKim-Mead and White barracks. And this is what it looked like when we came to the project after Westgate won the competition in 2008. Really kind of what you would expect an old military base to look like, not too great. And this is where our office is, oops, up in the Upper West Side. So when we came to the island, it was full of old Coast Guard barracks, old buildings, kind of like, the worst of military infrastructure. And Audrey made this awesome sketch which is what he does, which is what if Governor's Island could be transformed into kind of a green topography that rivals Manhattan, like a broccoli island. And so we went wild, and the sort of triplets of Belleville, super vertical, like what if this could be something that rivals the Statue of Liberty, a new monument for the city, but totally democratic. And these are some of the images from the competition. The idea of making this really vertical green landscape as a counterpoint to what was there won the day. So it's not just about like monument, it's also about romanticism and wayfinding. That space, which is so flat, you can almost understand and see the entire thing when you come out to it. Once you start to make it topographic, make these corridors, make choreography, you basically you make it 100-fold. You make it so much more rich and interesting. And we, as the Dutch as outsiders, we're very much picking up on the kind of Olmsted legacy and the legacy of the Hudson River School of Painters, this sort of picturesque, romantic, even a little scary and sublime, and all these dudes, painters, landscape architects. It was not a West State invention, in other words. So we wanted to kind of take a new spin on Olmsted and Vox, take a contemporary spin on Central Park, and do it in a really kind of charismatic and joyful way for the 21st century. So this is the original path network, path structure. We want to make it super undulating and romantic, and kind of, you can get a little bit lost. Part of the joy of Governor's Island is that you have to take a ferry there, and you basically leave your New York City frenzy and stress away. You slow down a little bit. And we created this topography and this path structure that's very winding, very romantic, what's around the corner. And of course, being Dutch, there had to be the bikes. So this is another special thing about Governor's Island for New Yorkers. If you're a kid growing up in New York, it's pretty tough to learn to ride your bike. There's not a lot of free open spaces. So this is a car-free island, and so we designed a custom bike that went with the island. And when the Prime Minister of the Netherlands came, he had to test it out. He gave it a thumbs up. He said it worked. So it's very much designed for bikes and kind of discovery. This is the master plan. And then this is a little bit more of the technical background to it. So behind the scenes, while we were making this kind of super charismatic, cartoonesque vision of vertical hills and mountain goats, there was a very serious research that we were doing into projected sea level rise. So at this point, which was way back in 2010 or whatever, we used the US climate report from the United Nations and basically took the 100-year projection of future storm surge as the datum. And so we designed that any trees that we were going to plant that weren't salt tolerant would be planted above that level. And it's not just for the trees, this is a whole redevelopment project. So these areas here, which flank the park, in the future will also be raised. And those will be new mixed-use developments that will be above storm surge. So from a horticultural perspective, super important. We want to make sure that we don't plant this beautiful park and have the whole thing wiped away by a salty storm surge. Here you see phase one starting to get shaped. At its tallest in phase one, it's about 18 feet above that flat pancake that you saw before. And then Superstorm Sandy hit. I think this was 2015? No, 13, sorry. And it really devastated Manhattan. Was anybody there? Anybody else there during this? It was traumatic and crazy, and all of lower Manhattan was flooded, and the lights were off. And Governor's Island, as you can see, this is the map, would have been, the entire fill would have been underwater. We had actually started construction at that point, so our little piece of the park was above the storm surge. And all the contractors parked their equipment on top of the fill, and our client was like, I'm so happy, I told you guys to design a resilient park, and I hired a Dutch architect. It's, she gave herself a big pat on the back, and everybody was pretty pleased. But that resiliency piece is pretty important, and it sort of proved itself after Sandy. The second part of the project is the hills. So here you see these amazing landforms in the kind of foreground of Manhattan. These are the broccoli that we're going to see. We had this idea that we were going to recycle all of the debris from the island and use them to make the hills. So once that all got kind of sorted and demolished and all the hazmat taken away. It was a pretty small percentage of the hills, but still like so much better to reuse that in place. And we basically used it as like the core of the largest hills, this kind of pulverized building material. So here are the guys getting all the fill material together. And this was the coolest thing during construction, to see the kind of romantic hide and reveal that we were trying to achieve start to take form, and you start to see the lady, just a little bit, these peaks. Here they are building Outlook Hill, the bigger of the two. And I can't even tell you, she looks so much bigger with a foreground. Somewhat, maybe a photographer can tell me why. I don't really know, but it's pretty amazing. We had a really serendipitous moment during the project, which is that the historic seawall was deemed failing. And we were like, goody, more free materials. So we got this awesome barnacle-covered granite from the seawall, and we reused it in the hills, and we made this sort of giant staircase. And I've designed quite a few playgrounds, but this is the best. This is like the best playground, not a playground, that I've been able to design. We did design some real playgrounds with it as well, these awesome slides, which you'll see in a second. But this sort of giant staircase became a sort of serendipitous feature that just allows you to sprint up to the top of the 90-foot hill if that's your thing. Here you see the guys planting it. And then finally when it's open. So this sort of taking what was culturally, basically integral to the island and reusing it and putting it on the surface. And the great thing is when you walk on these big granite boulders, you can see the old barnacles and you can see the old seaweed, and it's like you look at it and it doesn't make any sense, and I think that's so lovely. So here we are at opening day. This is, as I said, a really awesome feature. And then here's the park starting to grow in. So the topography has this white highlighter that's sort of meant to take your eye so you know where you're going. It's all precast concrete, thousands and thousands of pieces of precast concrete. But I think it really does that job. It kind of sinuously takes you around the island. It makes it feel a little more contemporary. It kind of pops the green. And it also has this sort of secondary use, which like every kid walks this way. I don't know why. It's just sort of like, now it's a thing that the kids race. They race on the curb. So Governor's Island, as I said, it's really about kind of a delight and a respite for the people of New York City, and there's lots of playgrounds and gardens. It's not in the ubiquitous West 8 red for the most part, because we wanted to kind of keep it quiet, neutral, a little more Olmstedian. But then our client killed us and got red hammocks just because she had to torture us a little bit that way. There's over 40 species and 1,800 trees on the island. We went for a more, I would call it agricultural approach in terms of planting. So we had another client who was a developer come out and say, it's so messy. We said, well, yeah, it's forestry, basically. We put in all these whips, and it's kind of survival of the fittest, very Olmstedian. A lot of them died, some of them didn't, and the things that are going to grow in that super salty, wind-borne environment are going to survive, and that's great. So we worked with a pretty much native palette, some ginkgos and some other very tolerant trees, and now it's starting to grow in. So the main point of this vegetation is not to be a kind of shiny developer project, but to just do a job, like a real workhorse job, which is to tolerate the brine and the wind and keep these hills from eroding. So here's Slide Hill, the tallest slide in Manhattan. It goes super fast. It's really awesome. One of my friends actually burnt a hole in his shorts. He went so fast. Great. This is our team on opening day at the top of Outlook Hill. Just a really great place to relax and get a 360-degree view. And then the way it sort of frames the city in a new way, just keep creating these new horizons and these new panoramas. And probably the money shot, of course, is this, you can see, I love this kind of relationship. A lot of people in New York had never been able to see Lady Liberty face on, which is how you're meant to see her, right? Arriving by boat to New York, being welcomed, and now there's this island which is completely free, open to the public, and everybody gets that kind of invitation, looking straight at her. Okay, back to Texas. So the last project I want to talk about is one of our babies in the office, Houston Botanic Garden. Houston doesn't have a botanic garden, which is really surprising because they have everything else. They have amazing museums, amazing cultural institutions. Is anyone from Houston? Did you know that you didn't have a botanic garden?
Yes.
You knew that, good, okay. So when we heard about this project, we were like, we are all in. This is an incredible opportunity, but none of us knew anything about Houston. We sort of thought it's freeways, I think, mostly. But we sort of arrived at the moment that SWA's work and a lot of the Bayou Greenway's work was really starting to kind of show the magic of the whole Bayou network, which runs beneath the rest of the city. And so this was really great. We learned a lot about the kind of history of the city on the bayou, why they're used for drainage. As you know, Houston sits on basically thick, black, impenetrable clay, so it doesn't drain, so the water has to go away. So the bayous not only are culturally important, but really, really functionally important. And many channels were dug further out of the bayou as the city developed. So our site, for those of you who know Houston, is here in the southeast. This is downtown. We're on Sims Bayou, which is kind of a lesser known bayou, just north of Hobby Airport. And this is the original bayou, so it's so great. We were on this original meander of the bayou. Here it is in 1915. And then you see what's this? So then the Army Corps, our old friends, cut this giant channel through the front, basically to shortcut the water, get it out faster, get more of it out. And in a place like Houston, that's pretty functional, pretty important. So this was like the worst golf course in Houston, basically, when we came to it. There was a little bit of some public pushback from the people who loved this golf course quite a lot, who were like, no botanic garden. Like, there was like a strong group of 12 people who hated botanic gardens. But hopefully when it opens in 2020, even they will be won over. So we seem to have bad luck because Harvey hit then right after we started this project. It definitely raised the kind of thinking about flood and resilience with our client group who were not thinking about it too much before. Luckily our site is pretty well draining, but it still made us think about how are we going to deal with all this water on the edges. So the site is sort of in two parts. There's this island, which is where the old oxbow connects to the channel, and then there's this land side, which is sort of nestled into the neighborhood. So you can see the 100-year and the 500-year floodplains here. The water is brackish when it comes up during a storm surge and on most days. Harvey was not a surge, but was an inundation, and it was about a 700-year flood event. So for the purposes of this project, we were mostly worried about the salt because it's a botanic garden. So we're really thinking about what are we going to do with those collections that need to get up above this brackish water table. So the sort of first, more ecological and pragmatic part of the project was to really think about those edges. So we designed a lot of resilient gardens on the edges, bayou gardens, native gardens, really workhorse landscapes, things that will thrive in Houston that are either native or natively adapted. And basically shaping that land along the meander. And then the idea was that that will allow you to put your more precious collections up high and out of the salt. So here we are on the site. This is one of the ecologists that we worked with who told us a lot about the bird corridors and the habitat. It's a really interesting part of Houston because it's where a lot of native plant communities come together. So part of the program will be representing these native habitats and ecosystems of the Houston area in that bayou edge. And then, of course, to make them for people. So kayak trails, educational programming on the edge, and to shape it into something better than an Army Corps channel. So to really make boardwalks and beautiful undulations and articulations on the edge. So it could look something like this someday. The other thing that was really amazing to us as kind of Northeasterners was the kind of lushness of the landscape in Houston. For those of us who had never been there, we didn't really know what the feeling was, but it was really romantic. And it kind of gave us this idea of this garden in the center of the island being a kind of paradise, something kind of framed by this wild bayou landscape, something precious and kind of potent in the middle. So we were really interested in this narrative of kind of the Houston wilderness on the outside and something really kind of formal and gem-like in the middle, the paradise. And in a lot of very humid, hot climates like Houston, this is the way gardens have always been. They're sort of a room carved out of the wilderness. This is an Egyptian image. Eden, of course, this idea of everything's paradise on the inside and terrible on the outside. So this sort of mythical paradise we thought was interesting as a driver for the design, and we sort of already had the wilderness ready-made because of our site. And because of the climate in Houston, which is basically deadly hot in the summer, also very humid, unlike Spain, we're really interested in shade. So how are we going to deliver shade on day one when the trees are tiny, no one's going to come? We can't do a Governor's Island approach where we put in whips. We need to deliver real shade, architectural shade on day one. So some of our wonderful references, like the Alhambra. Also some great Houston references. So we spent a lot of time at the Bayou Club, which is where we had a lot of our meetings. We see all these big, shady porches, wonderful inside, outside. And we sort of came up with this idea of a sort of tessellated colonnade that's going to kind of orient you to all the different collection gardens throughout the site. So these are just some early sketches, different orientations and geometries of how these series of rooms could adjoin the different sides of the site, and some early studies for the colonnades. And eventually, not in phase one, but eventually a large conservatory. So this is that big round one in the middle. So this is the overall scheme, this sort of framing of the beautiful cultivated garden paradise in the middle. And we came up with a master plan. So this is about a 30-year master plan. We're in phase one right now. It's entirely privately fundraised, so we've had to put a lot of pretty pictures together for this client group. One of the questions as a botanic garden is, what is the collection? So Desert Botanic Garden has a very strong collection of native desert plants. Brooklyn Botanic is known very much for its cherries. The women, and it was mostly women on our board, were very serious about this. They wanted a very serious collection. And when we sort of talked about, for what, for why, you can think back to, well, why does Kew have what it has? Like for the good of the empire, right? Why does Uppsala have what it has? It was sort of the beginning of scientific inquiry and taxonomy. So we had a really great client who really thought that the collection here should be in keeping with and reflecting the diversity of Houston, which is actually the most diverse city in the country at this moment. We got really great turnout at our public meetings, and we've also been continuing to get great feedback about technique and plants that are very important to different cultures within Houston. So we want people to come to the garden and everybody recognize something that they know from home. It's also climatically very broad what you can grow in Houston, almost tropical and temperate and subtropical at the same time. And then finally, we wanted to forefront beauty and display. And these ladies are just like the best. So these are some of the women on the board. Every time we would go to an event with them, they were dressed like this. And we were like, this is not like the black clad Manhattan kind of thing. So it really gave a lot to the project. So these are the ladies. This is one of the design drawings of one of the plans. It became a project which was sort of about maximalism. This is a bridge that has these ornamental trees going up and over. So it was like more in each of these gardens. And we started to define what they all are. So you can see here the garden rooms. Some of them were about maximal display, others about things that are very important in Houston. So as a group, they were very, very proud of the contributions that Houston as a city has given to the world. So of course we need a NASA garden. There'll be kind of a moon-themed garden. We'll have the conservatory where we have the tropical lilies and all the beautiful tropical plants that can be brought from Mesoamerica. And then I'm going to take you through phase one. So this is a little bit of, there's 3 main gardens that we're designing for phase one. You enter going over a bayou, and just that kind of very first bridge over the bayou kind of does something where you feel like you're leaving the city a little bit. Going over the oxbow. We really pulled a lot from what you see in the landscape of Houston. This is South Boulevard. We said, let's do this, but more, like more ornamentals, more understory. So like a really luscious garden-esque entry. And then you park in this grove of oaks, and you enter, you kind of slide by a building and enter into the pine grove. So the first garden is the global garden. It is an arid, tropical, and subtropical garden. Everything is green. The fountains are green. There's frogs. There's fish. Everything is kind of dripping with plant life. This is the full look at the plan. So not a restrained garden, really max to the max. This is a great reference we wrote from California, but even thinking about the pathways that we want to make sure the garden can come in between the cobblestones and in between the pavers so that there's nothing that just feels like a Houston sidewalk. Like everything should feel very much kind of green and verdant. This drawing style we also sort of invented for this project, inspired by the ladies, but also as a way to kind of really appeal to children, which was another important part of the project for the donor group. A lot of them are grandmothers. They kind of saw this as a garden for their grandchildren. So this sort of cartoonesque, rolled doll sort of vision was something that was kind of rewarding. Here we are in the Arid Garden. This is a real cactus. It's actually purple. And these are my two. So they gave a lot of inspiration for different ways that you could use the garden. So how are we going to make a lot of children-friendly areas in the garden without making a children's garden? Nobody wanted like a stupid, plastic, colorful thing in the garden. So lots of small objects, lots of bridges, lots of boardwalks, lots of kind of hopscotchy sort of moments within the garden. We have these small little dog houses. There are these small cabinets that the children can kind of go in. So all these sort of secret moments that are sort of childlike and child-size are interspersed throughout the garden. Stepping stones, stairs, they all sort of link together in a circuitous figure 8, so they can't escape. We don't want that. We want them to stay in the garden. Oh, that was pixelated, sorry. This is the colonnade, so you get that shade on day 1 and the vine collection. And then, of course, in Houston, you need rain cover. So here we are at the edge of the global garden. Both a place for the vine collection to start on day 1 and also shade on day 1. Second of the 3 is the edible garden. I probably can't say this here, but everybody in Houston says they have the best food in the country. They do? Okay. Very amazing food. So the edible garden is all about playing with microclimate. So trying to maximize what you can grow in Houston on the south side of a wall, on the north side of a wall, tucked into a different, into a little cubby. This is a Burle Marx wall from Brazil. So we sort of played with this idea of different walls, different sidedness, and in a 1 acre space made like a huge diversity of technique and ways that you can grow. And we designed this custom mosaic that takes some of the core collections of the garden, fern collection, vine collection, and kind of made them a mosaic mural so that every wall has kind of a cool side and a warm side. So here you are coming underneath the welcome pavilion into the edible garden. We start with the olives. Then you see some of the walls. So all of these planters have seasonal change out. Some of them are more permanent. And we really play with technique. So some of these sort of time-honored techniques like espalier are kind of played up in this garden, the different ways you can train and torture and shape plants on structures. There's a children's garden here where it's seasonally planted with gourds and fruits every year. Here are the walls in kind of relief. So you see the espalier and the fountains all starting to layer up. I think that's Swiss chard. Looks like Swiss chard. And then the last of them is the children's lagoon. This is an existing lagoon on the site. And like I said, we didn't really want to make a children's garden. If you've been to botanic gardens recently, they're pretty kitschy. It's like a lot of like iPads in the garden kind of stuff, which was not what we wanted to do. So we really wanted to play with water, nature play, really kind of sensorial ideas. Again, my little test subjects here, kind of thinking about how loose objects and strange anatomy of plants and loose materials could add up to something really great. So it's a series of experiences that are really appealing to kids. So the boardwalk, the maze, weird shapes, things that float, weird forms, things that reflect, and then we had to have carnivorous plants because these are totally weird and crazy. So this all sort of wraps around into a much more naturalistic area around the lagoon with some play structures tucked in there when you really need to burn off some energy. So we have a wonderful kid named Vincent in the office who does these sort of like worm drawings to help us kind of think about play structures. So we have tree houses, we have boardwalks, Here you see the tree structure. We have a beach. And then we have the kids at the edge of the lagoon. Thank you. I think we have 10 minutes? Did I see that right?
Time for questions?
Yes.
With the oysters and so much emphasis on them, is that just for economics, or is it because oysters can filter so many gallons of water pure?
We use the oyster as sort of the test fit to see if it would work, because if the oyster survives us flushing all this fresh water on top of it, then the salinity balance is also gonna work for the local fishery, so all the local economics of that place are kind of reflect whether or not the oyster survives. So it's sort of an indicator species. And what we wanted to do is make sure local economics and local culture could stay. So that's why the oyster and not a fish or a bird or something like that, because they can't move, right? So they're also, very important environmentally and ecologically. So. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you work with a consultant on the plants for the Botanic Garden? And
Yes.
can you talk about that relationship?
Sure.
And then also, was there any thinking about climate adaptation in the selection of plants?
Yeah, so the question was if we worked with a local for the plants, and then also about climate adaptation for that plant list. So we worked with a local firm called Clark Condon, who are a well-known firm in Houston. I would say they probably contributed 60%, but then we had a super active board and kind of civic group, people from Houston Parks, who were also contributing, debating, disagreeing about plants. So it's super passionate, and sometimes it's one of the ladies basically makes the final call that I do or do I not want that particular plant. In terms of climate adaptation, yes and no. There's some things that at this point, we don't quite know how to plan for, like the post oaks, for instance. They're all dying. So rather than trying to solve that problem as part of phase one, we have a kind of reforestation plan to replace those with other species. We've also, in the plant list that we've been working on with Houston Parks Board, they've been providing some input into things that are doing well and things that are not doing well. But it's not like we didn't have a plan for the things that were going to be flooded that's different than what a native list would be. Yep.
With the Governor's Island, did you guys consider, or you probably did, but were you involved in thinking of that transportation, that ferry that you have to take? Thinking of probably where you're going to park, how long of a line you're going to stand in, just to get to a park, rather than you can just go out from the city, walk into Central Park,
Yeah.
in your big park, right?
Yeah.
You take out
Yeah.
3 hours of your day just to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so parking in New York, not a big deal. No one drives. But the logistics of the ferry on both sides was a really big deal. So yes, we worked a lot with the client looking at where the truck's going to come in, where's the fire truck going to come in, and then when you introduce bikes, which is something that most New York City security contractor ferry guys have never dealt with, it was like a whole nother layer. So we probably made 30 different layouts for both the landing and the embarkation point to try and test how it's going to work. And I won't say it's perfect. Perfect would be a tunnel or a bridge to kind of separate those uses. We couldn't afford that on this project, so it's sort of a series of operational scenarios where they kind of have to say, bikes go here, children go here, okay, trucks go across. It's not sexy, but we did do it. Yep.
You mentioned like 100 and 500-year floods for the Houston Botanical Garden. Did you guys try and incorporate like the recent Atlas 14 at all?
We got a little more specific than that because we were really just focused on what's the risk for our program. So our program, it doesn't include any permanent residences. It doesn't include any places that people are going to be in 24 hours a day. We were really just focused on plants. So we worked with some climate scientists at Rice and really focused on duration of inundation, so how long is it inundated with fresh water, and then frequency of storm surge and the kind of elevation of the storm surge. So those are really the two factors that we looked at, and for the most part the plants can handle the freshwater deluge, most of the ones we chose. We had a sort of soil profile that's specific for the arid, but for the salt, we basically just raised that area up. So we had a cut and fill operation in the plan, which is going to raise it above, beyond what the Harvey, beyond, I think it was Ike, which was the storm surge. So we basically surpassed the worst case that we've seen so far. Yep.
It's very clear that you guys value sustainability and resiliency. How do you couple that mindset with the fact that it takes so much water to sustain the landscape?
For the Houston project?
Sure.
That's a great question. So recently we haven't had a problem with too much water, or not enough water in Houston. So that hasn't been a huge concern because basically their lagoons are full. And the irrigation, it basically comes from the city. So they are doing some water harvesting, they're trying to be mindful, but they haven't seen a drought in many years in Houston, so that's not at the top of their mind right now. In the future, they'll probably have to start thinking about a little more water harvesting than they're doing in phase 1.
Did the bikes make it into the final concept?
For Governor's Island? Yeah. Not the actual wooden bike, sadly. But what I heard was, at the interview for the competition, there was 5 finalists, and field operations presented their very kind of atmospheric, kind of monochromatic project, and then Adrian rode in on a wooden bike and rang the bell and was like ding 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 ding, and everybody clapped, and that was it. So I think it won us the project, but they do have a free bike program, but not the wooden ones, fortunately. Yes.
Great work. You mentioned the 30-year plan, and I just wondered sort of with your Dutch, prognosticators cap on, what do you see the state of these projects at in 30 years?
Great question. It's all a bit different. I mean, I have to say with Giving Delta 1, I'm pretty pessimistic. I just don't know. As I said, my brother lives there, and he's like, New Orleans doesn't want to be saved, so I have no idea what's going to happen. The other two, it really just depends on the client group. I think New York City does a pretty good job taking care of their parks. It's going to be developed, so the park is going to change dramatically because it's going to have probably institutional tenants on either side.
More specifically with sea level rise?
Okay.
Obviously the same issue.
Yeah.
Where do they see that being in 30 years? Do they game that out? Right?
So the Dutch they sort of look at it 2 ways. It's inland flooding, which is what they're planning for those Room for the River projects. Sea level rise, they're taking basically a fortress approach to it. So they're keeping the sea out 100%. When water's coming from upland, from the Rhine or whatever, they're basically letting the fresh water go wherever it needs to go. Yep.
Was there any sort of site selection process for the Houston project? And I'm just curious about the factors that went into why specifically that area.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was the site when we came to the project. We interviewed for the project, and I think it was the 3rd site that they had landed on. One of the ladies that I showed you, Nancy, I think she's 95, and this has been her dream since the 70s, and finally they got a site, and it was all about an agreement with the city and da-da-da. But it was controversial because many of the stakeholders are not from that area of town, and it's a big risk for them. They're like, I don't know, is anybody going to come? We don't know that area of town. Personally, I think it's great. You spread your cultural institutions across the entire city. But I think at the end of the day, it was sort of a deal with the reason they have that one. It was an underutilized city property, and they could kind of come to an agreement on it. But I think for the kind of cultural reach of the city, it's great that it's not in River Oaks. I think it's great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Many
of the geoscientists working in Mississippi are focused on delta progradation in support of growth of port activity. Was that your focus, or how do you envision growth of port activity?
So that was a little bit of the economics. Basically what the economists and the navigation and the port experts were saying was, for lack of a better term, there's sort of a stranglehold on the port that's not allowing it to change at the moment, and they're not preparing themselves for Panamax, they're not preparing themselves for global commerce, and so a big investment needs to be made, and if you're going to do that, move it further inland so you're out of that area of subsidence. But they're way behind. They're way behind where they should be, and given that New Orleans sits where the eastern, the central, and the western rail lines come together, it's kind of sort of idiotic that it's not happening, but it's happening in Houston instead, basically. So I'm not a real expert on it, but there was a slide with a lot of words on it, and that was our port and our economists put a lot of work into kind of the return on investment of that.
One weird question. I grew up in Houston in a Dutch family, and there's all these Dutch people in Houston, right? Like, because of Dutch chef.
Yep.
And there's Dutch stores, you can get Dutch anything, right?
Yep.
And the thing that I never got was the Dutch, at least the ones I knew, they love Houston.
Yeah.
Like, it's really crazy.
Yeah.
Like, and so I wondered about your group, like when they went, the Dutch guys, like what they thought. And
They love every place they go.
they love everything.
Yeah, I was telling Phoebe, they're like, let's move to Baton Rouge, let's move to Iowa. They're very cheerful.
And then I had another kind of follow-up question, which just was, I loved your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's just terrific. I know there's this whole thing in Holland about salt trauma, the idea of water coming back up behind the dike, and the whole idea that the flooding is less actually about direct kind of positivistic environmentalism. It's reaction environmentalism, it's reaction to salt seepage. And is that actually the case? Because like you talked about salt a lot, and I was wondering about this kind of salt trauma thing.
That's a great question. I'm going to see Adrian tomorrow. I'm going to ask him. He's obsessed with it, I can tell you that. Yeah, he's obsessed with salt. But I'll have to ask. I don't know enough about it. That's interesting. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you very much.